Okay, but before we get into it, can we just, can we just, like, it's giving, you know? Hey, it's Cecil, and it's Monday, and today we are talking about a topic that's very important to me, but also to just history in general. I think to some degree we definitely have all heard about the Stonewall riots, but I think that we kind of, I feel like a lot of historical context is usually missing from the conversations about the riots. And today I wanted to do kind of a deep dive into the history of what was going on with the queer rights movement before Stonewall and after Stonewall, especially because, in my personal opinion, it has a lot to do with how things are today. If we go all the way back to the beginning ish of the 20th century, shortly after World War One, at this point, the neighborhoods of Greenwich and Harlem became home to a relatively large queer population. On top of this, shortly thereafter, when Prohibition is going on, even though there was not allowed to be any public or private establishments specifically for queer gathering, with the quick pop ups of speakeasies that would be there one day and they'd be gone the next, police were not able to, like, keep up with all of that. So during this time, the community kind of thrived because they had places to meet. And so these areas sort of became a key feature of the queer community. It is also worth noting, if you did not know, Stonewall is in Greenwich. Now we move on to after World War II. This is during the Red Scare. And you're like, Cecil, what does what does queer history have to do with the Red Scare? A lot more than you'd think. During the time that potential communists and anarchists were being, like, pulled aside and being targeted and blacklisted, and it was believed that, they were anti-American or whatever, queer people were also being tracked and blacklisted and targeted because they believed that queer people were mentally unstable. And because of this, they thought that we would be easier to blackmail or to, like, coerce into partaking in communism. Whatever the hell that means. Between the years of 1947 and 1950, 1,700 federal jobs were denied, 4,380 people were discharged from the military, and 420 people were fired from their government jobs, all on the speculation of being queer. In the 50s and 60s, the FBI and the local police would sort of keep a running list, would keep tabs on suspected queer people. USPS kept a list of addresses that seemed to have some gay shit being sent to or from. Cities performed sweeps to try and rid public spaces of queer people, outlawed cross dressing, and unis started to expel queer instructors. When we say we're going back to the 50s, that's what it feels like right now. And so, in response to things like sodomy laws and all of that, over in LA, the Mattachine, I'm going to put the name here on the screen because I don't really know if I'm saying it right, Society was founded by gay men to, quote, unify homosexuals, educate them, and provide leadership and assist sexual deviants with legal trouble. So, sexual deviance is in quotation marks because obviously all queer people who dared to be queer in public were considered sexual deviants, even if they were literally just minding their business. They were met with pretty intense opposition to their radical approach, and so instead, they switched their platform to one of assimilation and respectability politics. Around the same time, we have lesbians founding the Daughters of Bilitis, another thing that I'm going to put on the screen because I cannot guarantee I'm saying it right, in San Francisco. At first, they would meet in each other's homes so that they would have a place to gather safely and dance. But eventually, they also started to prioritize things like assimilation and respectability. In 1952, One Incorporated is founded, and they begin publishing a magazine. In 1953, USPS refuses to deliver one of the issues because of obscene content. The obscene content in question was just an article about gay people in straight marriages. They took it all the way to the Supreme Court and they ruled in one's favor, but it took until 1958. Also, in 1952, busy year, homosexuality was added to the DSM as a mental disorder. However, psychologist Evelyn Hooker did a comparative study on a well adjusted gay man versus a well adjusted straight man, and she found that there was no difference. This was in 1956, so it was a few years later. Her contemporaries were like, whoa, what is this? But, for gay people, we were like, yeah, duh. Now, as you probably can guess, gender nonconforming people and trans people were often kind of excluded from the activism of the Mattachine Society or the DOB, considered, similar issues, but like distinctly not the same. In 1959, a small riot was staged at the Cooper Donuts Cafe in LA. But in 1966, a slightly larger event took place in San Francisco featuring drag queens, hustlers, and trans women sitting in Compton's cafeteria. Cops were called to arrest the men dressed as women, and a riot ensued. This was very distinctly an act of anti-transness, not just anti-gayness. It was anti-queerness as a whole, and it started to really bring light the importance of intersectionality of queer issues. In the early 60s, New York City's mayor tried to rid the city of queer people so that the city could have a good image for in 1964 when they had the New York City World Fair. Liquor licenses were revoked from establishments that catered to queer people, and cops tried to entrap as many gay men as possible. And unfortunately, few lawyers would defend any undesirable cases. The New York City mayor who came after that one was persuaded by the Mattachine to stop entrapment, but the New York State Liquor Association was still revoking licenses to any businesses that they thought could become, disorderly. So basically, it was their way of saying, even if I can't explicitly discriminate, I'm still going to find a way around it. Even with the amount of people who were living in Greenwich, there weren't many non-bar type establishments where they could gather openly. Most gay bars at the time were owned by the mafia, not out of the goodness of their heart, as you would imagine. They mistreated their patrons, grossly overcharged, but with the upside of the fact that, one, queer people had a place to gather, and two, they paid off the cops to prevent raids. In 1966, the mafia invested $3,500 to turn Stonewall Inn into a gay bar. There was no liquor license, no fire exits, and no running water. Police were paid off once a week, and it was the only New York City bar for gay men where dancing was allowed. Despite the payoffs, police raids were still a regular part of most gay bar establishments. They occurred on an average of about once a month, and they would have to hide extra alcohol in back rooms and in cars to resume business as soon as possible if any liquor was seized. However, due to tip-offs, management usually was informed that a raid was coming beforehand, and they would be scheduled to happen early enough in the evening so that it wouldn't be too disruptive. Because again, the cops were being paid off by the mafia. Anybody who did not have ID on them or were dressed in full drag were arrested. Women not wearing at least 3 pieces of feminine clothing were arrested, and management and employees were also typically arrested. However, raids started growing in frequency leading up to the Stonewall riots in June of '69. 4 clubs in Greenwich were completely closed, and Stonewall was actually raided the Tuesday before the riots. The mafia was raking in cash from obviously more sources than just their gay bars. Like, come on, you've got to diversify your assets. Historian David Carter hypothesizes that basically, because the mafia was getting more money from other sources, the cops decided they weren't being paid off enough, and so they were going to make trouble in the gay bars because a cap. And so it kind of became the police mission to close Stonewall permanently. On June 27th, 1969, two policemen and two policewomen enter Stonewall undercover to start collecting visual evidence. Employees were not tipped off for the incoming raid. At 1:20 a.m., four plainclothes police officers, two patrol officers in uniform, Detective Charles Smith, spelled like this. I'm sorry, that's the most ridiculous way I've ever seen that spelled. And Deputy Inspector Seymour Pine announce a raid. Remember, usually raids happened early in the evening to not be so disruptive, and management was tipped off. This was happening at 1:20 a.m., middle of business hours, right? Management was not tipped off. And they did their best to not let them figure out what was happening. There were approximately 205 people in the bar that night. Some of them tried to flee once they realized what was going on, but the police had the exits blocked. Except that, like, immediately things don't go as planned, right? This is not a normal raid. Partially because nobody was prepared for it, so how was it going to go orderly? But also because there was so much chaos. Cross-dressers and trans women refused to go with the police. The men in line refused to show their IDs. And so the police decided, well, fuck it. Let's take everybody to the station. Because, you know, what could go wrong? Women were felt up inappropriately during frisking, and that started to make, like, around that time was when the crowd started to just get increasingly uncomfortable. Like, this isn't good. This is not going well. Even though they decided we're going to take everybody back to the transport to the office would have happened by patrol wagons, but the patrol wagons had not arrived at the bar yet. In the meantime, 28 cases of beer and 19 bottles of hard liquor were seized, and patrons were required to wait in line for about 15 minutes. However, not everybody was arrested, and those who were not were released from the front door. But they didn't leave as quickly as you usually would leave after being released, right? Usually you're like, gotta get out of there. They were like, you know what? No. They left slowly, and then they stopped outside. And because that was weird for a police raid, some of the people just in the area started to form a crowd to see what's going on. Soon, between 100 and 150 people had gathered. As the police were forcing patrons out of the bar, some of the patrons who were released started, like, performing for the crowd, posing and mock saluting the officers, you know, just being silly goofy and making a mockery of the whole situation because it was absurd. By the time that the first wagon arrived, the crowd was at least 10 times the number of people who had been arrested to begin with. There was confusion over the radio comms, and that delayed the arrival of the second wagon as well. So first, and most importantly, mafia members were loaded into the wagon. Then employees. Someone shouted "gay power," and the crowd was reacting to the whole situation with a sort of angry humor, right? Like, it's funny, but in the way that a riot's going to start. An officer shoved a drag queen. She hit him with her purse, and the crowd booed. Rumors began to spread that patrons were being beaten that were still inside. A butch lesbian was escorted out of the bar very roughly, and when she complained that her handcuffs were too tight and she kept slipping away and she kept, fighting back, they hit her on the head with a baton. As she was loaded into the wagon, she looked at the crowd and she asked them, "Why don't you guys do something?" And from there, the riots broke out. Queens, hustlers, and homeless queer kids were the ones who threw the first projectiles. The most marginalized were the ones who were setting ablaze this event that we would celebrate every year afterwards. The riots went on until about 4 a.m. All day Saturday, people came to Stonewall to see what had happened there. The walls were graffitied with declarations of drag power and support gay rights. That night, thousands surrounded the street in front of Stonewall. Buses and cars were surrounded until occupants said, "It's okay, I think gay people are cool." When police captured demonstrators, the crowd recaptured them. And once more, rioting lasted until about 4 a.m. Older queens and members of the Mattachine thought that the riots were embarrassing. On Wednesday, the Village Voice, which was a newspaper in the Greenwich Village, ran reports of the riots with unflattering descriptions of the events and the participants. A mob descended on the street once again, threatening to burn down the offices of the Village Voice. This riot only lasted about an hour and is summarized as, quote, "The word is out. Christopher Street shall be liberated. The fags have had it with oppression." Christopher Street Liberation Day in 1970 saw anniversary marches, yes, on Christopher Street, as well as in Chicago and LA. By 1972, Atlanta, Buffalo, Detroit, DC, Miami, Minneapolis, Philadelphia, and San Francisco also held marches. Those from the Mattachine who were embarrassed, who thought that the riots were undignified, went against everything they were trying to prove about queer people. They expressed regret that it was undeniable that these riots accomplished so much more than their respectability and assimilation movement. And yet, barely 6 months after Stonewall, on December 21st, 1969, the Gay Activism Alliance forms. They once again center gay and lesbian rights, pushing themselves as politically neutral. Sylvia Rivera was highly critical of the GAA and their, once again, assimilationist gay rights policy. When demonstrations were expected to get dangerous, trans women, drag queens, the undesirables of the queer community, they would be brought in to be put to the front lines. And then at the end, when the press came, they would be shoved aside so that the more straight-assuming, the normal-looking queers could do the interviews and be the face of the movement. And once again, they were pushed out and pushed to the back. It's worth noting that the Mattachine and the GAA were primarily composed of middle-class, white, cisgendered gay people, centering themselves in the narrative. Except that this time, they weren't starting from nothing. They were riding the catalytic explosion put there for them by drag queens and disenfranchised queer people, which means that the movement became mainstream. Except it became mainstream with white cis queers at the front of it. And that leads us to today. In 2015, the LGB Alliance, basically the Drop the T movement, became solidified. It was the quiet part out loud. It was just a reinforcement of all of these earlier cis queer movements that intentionally excluded trans people and drag queens from their activism. Right now, we are facing an unprecedented amount of anti-trans legislation across the nation. That is not something that just happened. And yes, that is the fault of the people who are pushing that narrative. But cis queers, this is your time to stand up and stand with your trans siblings, okay? There is no respectability. There is no, you have to be quiet about it. You have to, you have to be palatable. None of this bullshit. Because this bullshit is the reason that we're going in circles. It's been over 50 years since Stonewall. And the people who acted as the catalyst for the queer rights movement and gay liberation, they are the ones who are dealing with the brunt of anti-queer rhetoric right now. Intersectionality is essential, and we have to say more than just Stonewall was a riot. Stonewall was started by Black drag queens and trans women, because while those things are true, you're missing what pushed it to that point and what happened to them afterwards. This was a really important video to me because it hurts my heart seeing what the queer community is going through, and it makes me angry every time I see cis queers start saying things negatively towards trans people, or trans people saying negative things about non-binary people, and they're all pushing these respectability and assimilation politics that have historically only worked for the most privileged members of the community who have not done a lot to bring everyone else up with them. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up, and if there is some fun queer history fact that you want to share in the comments below, go ahead and do that, and that'll be fun. You can follow me in the links in the description box below, and share this video with somebody who needs to hear the message of queer liberation. And if you have not done so yet, subscribe.